In the grand theater of history, few monarchs have painted their legacy in blood quite like Henry VIII of England. He didn't grab the throne through war or rebellion. He inherited it. But what he did with that power turned him from a promising Renaissance prince into one of history's most feared rulers. Even today, his name can still send a chill down the spine. When Henry Tudor stepped onto the throne in 1509, England was still licking its wounds from decades of brutal civil conflict. The Wars of the Roses had torn the country in two, and the Tudor dynasty was still young, new, fragile, and desperate to prove it belonged. Henry's father, Henry VII, had clawed his way to power through cunning and combat, laying a shaky but solid foundation. His son, though, Henry VIII, was cut from a different cloth, or so it seemed. He was tall, strong, educated, a picture-perfect Renaissance king. England in 1509 was a nation on the edge of transformation. The dark medieval age was fading, and the bright flame of the Renaissance was spreading through Europe. Art, philosophy, and politics were colliding in powerful new ways. And Henry? He wanted to be at the center of it all. He craved glory. Not just to be a king, but to be remembered as one of the greats. But here's the thing. Henry didn't fully grasp, or maybe just didn't care about, the cost of greatness. Not the cost he'd pay, but the cost others would pay for his ambitions. From day one, Henry was obsessed with legacy. He wasn't satisfied with ruling. He wanted to dominate, to immortalize himself in history books. That drive shaped every decision he ever made. His 6 marriages, his religious shakeups, and the cold, calculated executions that dotted his reign. His court might have sparkled with scholars and artists, but behind the glittering facade was a growing storm of paranoia, manipulation, and cruelty. People around him weren't companions or allies. They were pieces on a chessboard, useful until they weren't. And once you were no longer useful to Henry, you were disposable. So as we unpack the story of Henry VIII, know this. It's not just a tale of royal drama and messy love lives. It's a case study in how absolute power can turn promise into tyranny. How a golden boy prince became a lonely, violent, paranoid monster. What makes his legacy even more disturbing is how cleanly he wrapped his brutality in a cloak of righteousness. Every betrayal, every beheading, every calculated act of cruelty, he told himself it was all for England's good. In his mind, his ego wasn't the problem. It was the solution. But by the time his reign ended, the cost was staggering. Thousands dead. A nation permanently changed. The obsession that set everything in motion? A son. A male heir. In the 1500s, dynasties lived and died by their bloodlines. And Henry believed with everything he had that without a son, the Tudor name wouldn't survive. That belief would lead to 6 marriages, a massive religious upheaval, and a death toll that left a permanent scar on England. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first queen, was by all accounts a strong, intelligent, devout woman. She was royal in her own right and had been married to Henry's older brother Arthur before his untimely death. Her marriage to Henry was meant to secure the alliance with Spain and strengthen the Tudor hold on power. For 2 decades, she stood by his side as queen. But in Henry's eyes, she failed the most important test. She didn't give him a surviving son. The fallout wasn't just personal, it was political. By the 1520s, Henry became convinced that God was punishing him. He told himself the marriage had always been cursed because Catherine had once been his brother's wife, despite the church's approval at the time. Her miscarriages and the deaths of their infant sons were, to Henry, divine signs. Only one child had survived, a daughter, Mary. But to Henry, a daughter wasn't enough. When Pope Clement VII refused to annul the marriage, Henry faced a choice: obey the Pope or cut ties with Rome. For a man obsessed with being the ultimate authority, it was hardly a choice at all. So began the English Reformation, not out of theological passion, but because one man couldn't take no for an answer. In 1534, Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. He didn't just reject the Pope, he replaced him. Now Henry had total power, not just over laws and wars, but over the very souls of his people. One man who saw exactly what was happening was Sir Thomas More, Henry's Lord Chancellor. More was a brilliant scholar and devout Catholic. His refusal to recognize Henry's new religious authority wasn't just stubbornness. It was a stand against the idea that any mortal man could claim divine supremacy. In 1535, that defiance cost him his life. More was executed for treason, but his only real crime was standing up to the king's ego. Europe was stunned. Thomas More was respected everywhere for his intellect and integrity. Killing him sent a message loud and clear. In Henry's England, the king's word was law, above morality, above religion, above everything. With Catherine cast aside and his own church under control, Henry now focused all his obsession on Anne Boleyn. She was the opposite of Catherine, young, vibrant, and, in his eyes, full of potential. Henry had already spent years chasing Anne, and his desire for her had grown into a dangerous obsession. He wanted her not just as a mistress, but as queen. And if tearing apart the church was the price, so be it. Anne knew the stakes. She'd watched what Henry did to his first wife and understood that royal favor came with a ticking clock. But she also saw opportunity. For a time, Anne wielded enormous influence. She pushed Protestant reforms and placed allies in powerful roles. She was, for a brief moment, the most powerful woman in England. In 1533, Henry married Anne in a secret ceremony, before his marriage to Catherine was officially over. It was a move that screamed entitlement. The law didn't bind Henry, he bent it. But when Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, Henry's disappointment was impossible to hide. Another girl, another failure. Anne's future darkened with every miscarriage, and Henry's frustration curdled into resentment. By 1536, the same paranoia that had driven him to break with Rome was now aimed at Anne. The woman he once worshipped had become, in his eyes, another cursed queen. The charges against Anne that year were absurd: adultery with multiple men, including her own brother. Most historians agree the accusations were fabricated, a convenient excuse to get rid of her. But that didn't stop Henry. The man who had once written Anne passionate love letters now orchestrated her downfall with chilling efficiency. Her trial was a sham. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. And on May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed by a French swordsman, considered a mercy because it was faster than the axe. Even as she knelt for the blade, Henry was already planning his next wedding for the very next day. That quick transition says everything about Henry. No mourning, no remorse, just cold strategy. Anne was no longer useful, so she was erased, swiftly, brutally, and publicly, in the hands of his daughters, the very heirs he had tried so hard to sideline. Mary would become England's first reigning queen, and Elizabeth would go on to become one of the most celebrated monarchs in English history. The irony would have been lost on Henry, who never could have imagined that his long-awaited legacy would be carried forward not by the son he obsessed over, but by the daughters he once deemed political pawns. But before any of that could unfold, the full weight of Henry's final years needed to be reckoned with. By the time Henry married Catherine Parr in 1543, he was no longer the magnetic prince who had once dazzled Europe. He was obese, sickly, and deeply paranoid, haunted by ghosts both real and imagined. His court had become a brutal place, and everyone, courtiers, advisors, even family members, knew that proximity to the king was a double-edged sword. One moment of misjudgment, one misplaced word, and it could all be over. Catherine Parr, to her credit, understood this better than anyone. She wasn't driven by romance or ambition. She was driven by survival. She knew exactly what Henry was capable of, and she played the game with masterful caution. Educated, diplomatic, and shrewd, Catherine walked a razor's edge, supporting the Protestant cause while carefully avoiding any suggestion that she was challenging the king's authority. When she came under suspicion of heresy late in Henry's reign, she survived not through influence or luck, but by skillfully deflecting Henry's paranoia and appealing to his ego. Catherine's survival was rare in a world where queens were expendable, and it would make her the only one of Henry's 6 wives to outlive him. By the mid-1540s, Henry's physical condition had deteriorated to the point of horror. Historical records describe him as suffering from chronic leg ulcers so foul that few could stomach being near him. His once commanding physique had given way to bloated immobility, and his mental state had declined with it. He lashed out at advisors, cycled through favorites, and saw betrayal in every corner of his court. Yet even in this grotesque state, Henry wielded power like a weapon. He continued to sign death warrants from his bed, including for longtime allies who had fallen from grace. One of the most notable was Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, a poet, a nobleman, and the last high-profile execution before Henry's own death. His crime? Ambition, real or perceived. To Henry, that was enough. Even on the brink of death, he was settling scores. In January of 1547, Henry's long, bloody reign came to an end. He died surrounded by the trappings of power, gold, finery, servants, but utterly alone in spirit. His body, racked with disease and swollen with infection, was in such a grotesque state that funeral arrangements became a logistical nightmare. According to one grisly legend, his corpse burst open during the journey to Windsor, oozing with the rot that had consumed him from the inside out. It was a fitting metaphor. The man who had spent his life asserting dominance over others was finally undone by forces even he couldn't control. Age, illness, and the slow collapse of his carefully crafted world. But the question that lingers long after Henry's death is this: what did it all mean? Henry VIII didn't just change England, he reshaped it. His reign wasn't defined by military conquest or sweeping reforms born of vision. It was defined by ego, fear, and a relentless drive to be remembered. And in that, he succeeded. Nearly 500 years later, we still speak his name. But at what cost? The Reformation he ignited tore England away from the Catholic Church. Yes, but it also plunged the nation into decades of religious strife. The monasteries he dissolved destroyed centuries of cultural and architectural heritage. His relentless pursuit of a male heir led to countless deaths, from queens to commoners. And his obsession with control created a court culture so soaked in fear that it became a template for tyranny. Henry ruled as if he were divine, believing his every decision was not only justifiable but sacred. When he declared himself head of the Church of England, he wasn't just breaking from Rome. He was breaking from accountability. And that, more than any beheading or annulment, is what made his reign truly dangerous. Because when power becomes absolute, cruelty becomes policy. Henry's legacy, then, isn't just found in the laws he passed or the wives he married. It's found in the silence of those who feared him, in the hollow eyes of those who served him, and in the scarred landscape of a kingdom forced to adapt to his whims. In many ways, Henry VIII was a king out of time. He fancied himself a Renaissance man, educated, cultured, enlightened, but ruled like a medieval despot. His court was filled with poets and painters, yet ran on fear and blood. His vision of monarchy was as theatrical as it was terrifying, a stage on which he played the hero, the victim, and the executioner all at once. And yet, through it all, the man behind the crown remained shockingly consistent. From his early days as a charming, hopeful young monarch to his final years as a bloated, paranoid tyrant, Henry was always driven by the same two things: legacy and control. Every decision, whether to marry, kill, or convert, came back to those two obsessions. He wanted to leave a mark, and he didn't care how many lives had to be erased to carve his name into history. In that sense, Henry VIII was terrifyingly modern. He understood the power of image long before social media or spin doctors. He knew that perception could outlive reality, that if you told your version of the story loudly and often enough, it might just become the truth. And that's exactly what he did. Through portraits, proclamations, and pageantry, Henry shaped how he wanted to be remembered: strong, wise, ordained by God. But the truth beneath that carefully painted veneer is darker and more revealing. Because history doesn't just remember Henry as a king, it remembers him as a warning. Henry VIII was buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, in the same vault as Jane Seymour, the only wife who gave him a son, and the only one he ever seemed to truly mourn. It's a quiet tomb, marked by a simple black marble slab. There is no towering monument, no grand effigy to reflect the storm of his reign. In death, Henry is silent, beneath the stone, beneath history's gaze. But above that stone, the echoes continue. His children would inherit not just a throne, but a fractured nation. Edward VI, the son he had bled his country to produce, ruled only briefly before dying as a teenager. His reign was marked by Protestant zeal and manipulation by adult advisors, men who used the boy king as a vessel for their own ambitions. Then came Mary the Wempters, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, who tried to reverse the Reformation with fire. Her persecution of Protestants earned her the name Bloody Mary, and her reign was drenched in violence born from religious vengeance. It wasn't until Elizabeth I, Henry's daughter with Anne Boleyn, that England found a measure of stability. Elizabeth inherited her father's cunning and her mother's defiance. She navigated threats foreign and domestic, never married, and built a cult of personality that rivaled even Henry's. In many ways, she was the mirror image of her father, equally determined to control the narrative, but far more adept at doing so without the axe. And yet, even under Elizabeth, the shadow of Henry's reign never truly lifted. The Church of England remained, a monument to Henry's defiance. The political culture of fear and flattery he cultivated endured. The myth of royal supremacy, of divine kingship, still lingered in the bloodstream of the monarchy, pulsing beneath the surface of every coronation. Because Henry VIII didn't just kill people, he killed ideas. He executed the possibility of dissent. He shattered centuries of religious tradition, not to free his people, but to free himself. He weaponized marriage, turned love into law, and ruled not as a man among men, but as a god among mortals. He wasn't content with obedience. He demanded reverence, and terrifyingly, he often got it. So what are we to make of such a man? It's easy to reduce Henry VIII to caricature. The gluttonous tyrant, the wife killer, the bloated monarch surrounded by sycophants and shadows. But that simplification lets us off the hook. Because Henry wasn't a monster born from madness. He was a ruler born from a system that allowed, even encouraged, absolute power. He didn't invent tyranny. He perfected it. Every time he silenced a critic, Parliament gave him the tools. Every time he redefined marriage or religion or loyalty, the court nodded and adjusted. Every time he spilled blood, someone else handed him the pen. His terror didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a society that believed kings were chosen by God and answerable to no one but the divine. Henry simply took that idea to its brutal conclusion. And maybe that's the most haunting part of all. Because for every Anne Boleyn who lost her head, there were thousands of ordinary people who lost their voices, who watched their world change overnight, because one man couldn't bear to hear the word no. Their names don't appear in textbooks or drama series, but their lives were no less shaped by the king's desires. We remember Henry because he changed the course of English history. But we should also remember him because he reminds us how fragile freedom can be, how easily power distorts morality, how quickly charisma curdles into cruelty when left unchecked, and how history, if we're not careful, doesn't just repeat itself, it canonizes its mistakes. In the centuries since Henry's death, we've made him into theater, into myth. He's been played for laughs, for tragedy, for romance. But beneath all that spectacle is something harder to look at. A portrait of a man who used love as a weapon, faith as a tool, and fear as a throne. And for a while it worked. He got what he wanted, he got remembered, but he also got revealed. So next time we speak of kings and crowns, of power and glory, remember Henry VIII. Not just for what he did, but for what he proved could be done when no one dares to stop you. Because in the end, Henry didn't just leave behind a dynasty. He left behind a question. What happens to a kingdom when its ruler believes he is the only voice that matters? And perhaps even more unsettling, what happens when the people believe him